What if one day you saved a creature the world calls a monster and chose to protect it, even if it cost you everything? In the remote wilderness of Northern California, a reclusive 66-year-old man named Edwin Pike once set metal traps across the forest. Traps he now regrets. One autumn morning, he finds a young Bigfoot, injured and trembling, caught in one of those very traps. And instead of walking away, Edwin rescues it, bandages it, brings it home. Here's the truth no one tells you. That same trap was one he forged with his own hands, decades ago. Now, the creature's family begins to appear at the edge of the woods. They don't attack. They just watch. Edwin used to be a wildfire fighter. He knows what it means to destroy and to protect. Slowly, trust forms. Signs are exchanged, lives are saved, even his. By watching this story, you'll witness how a single act of kindness can rewrite a life of regret, how monsters may be more human than we think, and how redemption often begins in silence. When fire threatens the valley, Edwin burns his own cabin to create a firebreak and save the Bigfoot's home. And when a hunter is trapped in flames, it's not a man, but a Bigfoot mother who pulls him to safety, changing everything the town thought they knew. If you believe that goodness exists in people, in creatures, in choices, don't skip this story. Because when the world saw monsters, he saw a family. Dawn broke slow and pale over the timberline, the sky a milky sheet behind the dark silhouette of lodgepole pines. A thin breeze stirred the yellowing leaves and carried the scent of cold moss and old iron down through the hollow. In that dim hush of morning, Edwin Pike moved like a shadow between trees that had known him half his life. 66 winters had bent his shoulders and silvered his hair, but his steps were steady. The old canvas gunny sack he carried swayed against his back, creaking softly with each step as metal clinked faintly inside. Rusted traps, curled shut, one by one being returned to the land they once scarred. He didn't talk to himself. He hadn't in years. There was no need. The woods remembered him just fine without words. Each step up the ridge trail was like reopening a wound he'd meant to let close. Every tree, every stone carried some faint echo of him in his younger days. Days when fear had made him hard and hunger made him reckless. He hadn't laid a trap in over 2 decades. Not since he'd left the game trails behind and stopped calling himself a trapper. But the old guilt stuck like pitch to his hands. This was his final circuit, the last stretch of steel. He'd promised himself he'd get every last one, even if the forest had long outlived the memory of them. A jay shrieked overhead as he stepped over a fallen log slick with frost. The light was stronger now, a dim gold flickering through the trembling branches. His breath fogged the air in front of him as he stooped to the base of a boulder, reached into the crevice, and pulled out a trap so rusted it groaned in protest. He examined the jagged teeth, the tensionless spring. No longer a predator's snare, just a corpse of old violence. He wrapped it in an oiled cloth and slid it into the sack. When he stood, something far off cracked. Not a branch, not an animal, a cry. It was sharp, metallic almost, echoing off stone, like something torn loose inside the earth. He froze mid-step, heartbeat stuttering, unsure whether to run or listen harder. Then it came again, drawn out, higher-pitched, not quite human, not quite animal. And beneath it, another sound, faint but unmistakable. Iron on stone. Something struggling, something trapped. His boots shifted quietly over the lichen as he moved toward the sound, following instinct more than thought. He passed the tree line and slipped into a steep ravine where the light thinned and the air turned wet and still. Water trickled somewhere beneath the rocks, and the air tasted like damp pennies. The third cry was softer now, a whimper more than a scream. He crouched, scanned the shadows. There, between 2 leaning slabs of granite, Tangled in a bed of wet leaves and splintered twigs was a creature, small, curled, covered in thick gray fur matted with filth and blood. Its body hunched in on itself, not more than 3 feet tall, ribs rising and falling with effort. One leg, bent unnaturally, was caught in the rusted jaw of an ancient foothold trap. Its eyes met his, wide, black, too lucid for an animal. They didn't flash with terror. They didn't blink. They only stared, as if trying to understand him. Edwin went still, afraid to breathe. The weight of what he saw dropped into him like a stone in deep water. Not a bear cub, not a wolf, and not a child either. Something in between, or neither. He didn't move right away, just watched it breathing. Then, quietly, deliberately, he shrugged the gunny sack off his back, unwrapped his old fire-hardened lever stick, and took out the short knife he used to keep for gutting squirrels. He knelt beside the trap, the metal edges damp and spotted with blood, and muttered something low, not to the creature, not to himself, maybe not to anyone. The creature twitched as he reached down, but didn't pull back. Its hand, 5 fingers like a human's, though broader and covered in thick hair, gripped the edge of the rock. "I'm gonna be slow," he murmured, voice hoarse from disuse. "Don't jerk now." He wedged the stick into the spring's lever and leaned his weight on it. The trap groaned. The teeth gave. He slipped the knife between them to hold it open, then gently, as if lifting a bird's wing, pulled the trapped leg free. The limb trembled, skin torn at the edge of the fur, a deep puncture near the ankle, but no bone sticking through. Still, it was bad. The thing whimpered low, panting hard through clenched teeth. Edwin reached into his coat and pulled out the old flannel scarf he used for winter kindling, tore a strip, then another. He dabbed at the wound with trembling fingers, packed it with a mash of pine sap and shredded bark from his satchel, then wrapped it tight. The creature didn't fight him, didn't growl, only watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. When he tied the final knot, it reached out, not fast, not afraid, and touched the back of his hand. Just a single tap, faint as a falling leaf, and something in Edwin's chest gave way. He stared at it a long moment, breath caught in his throat. That look, that touch, it wasn't panic. It was something else, something closer to asking. He lifted it, careful not to jar the wounded leg, and pressed its small, damp body against his coat. It didn't resist. Its weight wasn't much, but the shape of it, odd, dense, unfamiliar, made his arms ache in strange ways. The trail home wasn't far, but every step felt longer with the wind rising behind him and the forest pressing in close. The trees didn't whisper. They watched. By the time the Choi came into view, the sun had lifted higher behind thin clouds. The shack stood lopsided against a slope of alder trees, roof patched with old tarp, door crooked on its hinges. He pushed it open with a grunt, ducked inside, and laid the creature down on a pile of old feed sacks he'd covered with a wool blanket. It curled immediately, pulling the blanket over itself the way a child might. Edwin poured a cup of water from the barrel in the corner, held it out, and waited. The creature sniffed, then drank, slowly, carefully, never taking its eyes off him. Later, as the stove clunked to life and the room warmed with the scent of dry cedar and iron, Edwin sat back in his chair and looked across the dim room at this impossible thing that now breathed under his roof. He didn't ask questions. He didn't reach for answers. Instead, he listened to the wind, watched the firelight shift across its fur, and for the first time in years, he felt the quiet settle inside him, not like a burden, but like a beginning. Outside, somewhere far in the trees, something moved, but it did not come closer, not yet. By late October, the valley had taken on the scent of dry leaves and cold stone. The mornings were slower now, colder, with a haze that hung low over the creek like breath held too long. The little wooden Choi sat quiet beneath the yellow crowns of alder and maple. its roof patched with bark and tarps, the porch sagging toward the slope like a man tired of holding himself up. From the chimney, a thin ribbon of smoke curled upward, vanishing fast into the bare branches above. Inside, the air smelled of smoked trout, pine resin, and the damp wool of an old man's coat hung near the door. Edwin moved slower these days, though not from age alone. It was the presence in the room that adjusted his pace, the one lying curled beside the hearth, wrapped in his old army blanket, fur matted but clean now, breathing with less pain. The creature hadn't spoken, hadn't made a sound outside of low huffs or the occasional sharp inhale when its leg ached. It didn't beg or lash out. It just watched. Watched the flames, watched Edwin stir the pot, watched the shadows move along the floorboards like ghosts it half remembered. He didn't speak to it either, not often. Maybe a few words when he handed over a piece of dried fruit or set down a bowl of broth. But mostly he let the silence stay, like something sacred neither of them wanted to break. The creature had begun eating better. It preferred the smoked fish, head, tail, skin, and all. Sometimes it sniffed at the juniper berries or rolled them around before pushing them aside. But the blackberries vanished quick, and it had taken to sucking the honey from pine cones he cracked open near the fire. When it moved, it limped, dragging the foot he'd wrapped. But it never cried out. Edwin would catch it pacing the edge of the porch some mornings, nose lifted to the wind, eyes scanning the tree line like it was waiting for something. Or someone. That made Edwin uneasy, though he didn't show it. He started walking wider circles around the choy before dawn, like a man checking fence posts that weren't there. Each morning, he'd find the earth disturbed in odd places. Not torn up, just shifted. A line of small stones near the woodpile, pine needles rearranged into subtle curves. Once, a row of berries set in a perfect half moon at the base of the porch steps. He never heard anything in the night. No heavy footfalls, no growl, no cry. Just the wind and the creak of trees. But those signs meant something was coming close. Watching. One morning, just as the fog lifted, he stepped out and saw a single handprint in the mud beside the creek. Large, splayed, with fingers too long to be human and too straight to be bare. He didn't say a word, just crouched beside it and stared. That afternoon, he took a strip of smoked trout, bundled it with some licorice root, and placed it on a flat stone 10 paces from the porch. Then he stepped back, left it there, didn't touch it again. The next morning, it was gone, replaced by a black feather and a twist of dry grass braided tight at one end. The wind came hard that night. It knocked ash from the stovepipe and rattled the shutters until Edwin nailed them shut with 2 rusted nails and a flat rock. Inside, the fire glowed hot, and the creature slept curled near it, arms tucked beneath its chest. Edwin lay awake in his cot, listening. Around midnight, something brushed the porch. Not soft, not sneaky, just one heavy step, deliberate, and then another. He didn't move. Then came the creak of wood as something pressed its weight on the floorboards, and the faint jingle of wind chimes that hadn't rung in over a decade. He sat up slow, eyes straining in the dark. Through the slats of the boarded window, a flicker of movement, too tall to be man, too still to be beast. A shape stood just at the edge of the clearing, then another, then a third, all still, all silent, their outlines blurred by wind and moonlight, but their presence unmistakable. The one in the center turned its head, eyes catching the faint orange glow leaking from a crack in the boards. Edwin didn't blink. He reached for the lamp on the floor beside him, lifted it to the window, and turned the flame up just a notch. The eyeshine flared. Not red like a deer's, not yellow like a dog's, but a deep matte gray, like river rock in the sun. They didn't move. They didn't charge. just watched. The lamp flickered once, then dimmed. Edwin held it steady. No words passed, no noise beyond the groan of trees and the hiss of pine needles in the wind. It was a conversation made without sound, a negotiation in breath and gaze alone. Then, as if cued by something only they could hear, the shapes turned, slipped back into the trees, one by one, like fog rolling downhill. Not a branch cracked, not a bird stirred. Only the silence, deep and steady, and the sense that something had shifted. Edwin lowered the lamp. He didn't sleep that night. Come morning, he found the stone 10 paces from the porch bare again. This time, he left nothing. No offering, no bait. Just walked to the creek, washed his face, and waited for the wind to speak. The creature didn't stir until late. It blinked slow, sat up, stretched its arms with care, and limped to the door. It stood there for a long while, staring at the spot where the tall figures had been. Then, without looking back, it stepped outside and settled in the grass, face turned to the trees like it was listening for something only it could hear. Edwin watched from inside, didn't call it back, didn't ask questions. That night before bed, he placed a second bundle. Berries, a strip of fatback, and 2 pine cones on the same flat stone. And just for a moment, just before he blew out the lamp, he thought he saw eyes in the dark again. Not hostile, not afraid, just watching, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. The sky had turned glassy and pale. A silent dome stretched over the ridgelines, and the wind cut sharper now. Frost curled the edges of every leaf, white lacework hugging the dirt, and even the smoke from Edwin's fire climbed more slowly, as if burdened by the cold. That morning the creature didn't stir. It stayed bundled in the wool blanket, curled into itself, its breath shallow but even. Edwin set a shallow bowl of crushed hickory nuts and dried berries near the hearth before pulling on his thick coat, threading each button with quiet fingers. He took the old pack down from the wall. The straps had stiffened, but he flexed them loose. He didn't write a note, didn't explain, just whispered a single word into the stillness, "Be," and stepped out into the biting wind. The trail was stiff with ice beneath the layer of fallen pine needles, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like something rusted hiding just beneath the surface of everything. His boots crunched with each step as he moved uphill, deeper into the part of the forest he hadn't touched in years. Not since the old days, not since the maps in his head had been drawn in blood and bait. He walked past the deer trail, past the old fire ring long buried under snow and memory, until he came to the bluff overlooking the ravine. That place never changed. Stone outcroppings slick with moss, a drop-off where wind howled upward in strange, hollow moans. And near the base, in the shallow indent where the trap had once clamped shut around soft flesh and bone, there it was. Half buried in frost-bitten soil and shards of rotting leaves, its metal edges glinting with cold light, was the old trap, the one that had caught the creature. His hands didn't move right away. His eyes just stayed on it, locked, as if some part of him had hoped it would be gone, that it had all been some strange trick of guilt and memory. But there it was, familiar, sharp in all the same places, bent in all the ways his own hand had forged it. He knelt, breath catching in his throat. The stamp was still there, barely visible under the rust. His initials. EP burned into the steel the way he'd once marked all his traps. Pride had driven that mark. Pride and a need to prove something when he was younger. That he belonged in the woods, that he had a claim here, that he mattered. He ran his fingers over the letters. They bit back at him, sharp with age and memory. A sound escaped his chest. Not quite a cry. Not a groan. Just a dry, breaking thing. He dropped his forehead to his hands and sat back on the heels of his boots, knees deep in frozen pine needles, shoulders shaking like a man left out in the wind too long. That trap hadn't just hurt the creature. It had branded his shame. It had survived his forgetting. And now it waited, like a debt unpaid. He didn't stay there long. The cold bit through the wool at his knees. He rose stiffly, pulled a canvas sack from his pack, and began to dig. Not into the earth, but under the rocks. The old line of traps still lay scattered along the ridge if you knew where to look. And he did. He knew every twist of wire, every hinge and spring and metal fang he'd ever buried there. Some still intact, some mangled by time. Each one he pulled free and dropped into the sack. His breath grew heavier, the bag heavier, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. By the time he made it back down to the choy, the sky had dimmed to steel. His shoulders sagged. His hands bled in 3 places. He didn't tend them. He stacked the traps in a ring outside the brick stove pit. They clanged dully, one atop the other, some sticking at odd angles like bones in a pyre. He coated them in pine pitch and cedar shavings, tossed in the splinters from the old wood box, and struck a match. The flames leapt fast, devouring the years he'd once called skill. Steel hissed. Springs popped like angry ghosts, trying to jerk awake. But they didn't. They died. They died slow in orange and blue light. He watched them with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, smoke curling into his eyes until they watered and burned. He didn't blink. The fire licked toward the sky, loud in a way the woods hadn't heard in years. Loud enough to make the ravens scatter. And through the smoke, at the far end of the clearing, they appeared. Not close, not menacing, not even curious. 2 of them, tall, motionless, half shadow behind the wall of brambles. One stood slightly ahead of the other, its shape broader, older maybe. The second was leaner. Both still as carved stone. He didn't reach for the lamp this time. He didn't lift his hand in greeting. He only pressed one palm against his chest, right where his ribs still ached from the cold, and held it there. A slow breath, in, out. They didn't move. The fire cracked behind him. Something in the pile collapsed, sending a plume of sparks up into the dusk. Still, they watched. Not the fire. Him. Then, without sound, they stepped back into the trees. The night came fast after that. He let the fire burn down on its own. No water poured, no stones placed. Just heat and ash and the smell of old sins burned clean. He didn't sleep that night either. Sat in the old chair with the blanket over his knees, watching the last of the flames flicker out through the cracks in the boards. The creature stirred once, opened its eyes, then settled again. Breath soft and slow, like it trusted the quiet for the first time. By morning, the fire pit was blackened. The traps gone. Only the char-stained ring of earth remained, and the faint smell of something metallic drifting off with the mist. He didn't speak. He didn't tell the creature what he'd done. He didn't need to, because that evening, just before the last light vanished behind the ridgeline, he found something placed at the foot of the steps. A single piece of bark, folded tight. Inside it, cedar resin, pine needles, and 3 strands of what looked like hair, woven into a knot that made no sense but still meant something. He held it for a long time, didn't unfold it, didn't burn it, just sat with it in his hand as the cold crept back in and the silence returned. Not heavy this time, not like punishment, but like a kind of promise, spoken in a language no man could ever truly learn. Winter didn't leave all at once. It hung on in the shade, beneath fallen pine boughs and under rocks slick with meltwater. The ice didn't crack so much as retreat, 1 inch at a time. The creek behind Edwin's choy had started to swell again, and the snowmelt ran fast over black stones, pushing bits of moss and bark downstream. The mornings were still sharp, still white around the edges, but the light held a different color now, and the wind carried scents he hadn't breathed in months. Wet loam, young fern, rot and root. life circling back in its quiet, patient way. He noticed it first above the doorway. A thin strand of peeled willow bark, twisted into a single knot. Not the looped kind he'd seen before. Just a tight, precise turn, tucked between the ends like someone had tied it with intent. It hadn't been there the day before. He stared at it, hand still gripping the latch, unsure if it was a message or a mistake. But it wasn't random. That much he knew in his bones. It hadn't fallen from a tree. It hadn't blown in. Someone, something, had left it. On purpose. He stepped back, looked at the line of the woods beyond the clearing. The trees watched, as they always did. No movement, no sound, just wind. Inside, the creature sat cross-legged near the hearth, now stronger, more balanced. Its coat had filled in, glossy under the firelight. It still limped when it moved, but there was a rhythm to it now, not pain. Edwin pulled a satchel from the corner, sat down at the table, and began to crush dried yarrow, goldenrod, and burdock into a soft flannel pouch. He added a strip of boiled spruce resin, wrapped it tight with jute twine, and tucked in a sliver of red cedar for good measure. Then he placed the bundle beside the willow knot on the porch railing and left it there. He didn't know what the knot meant, but he figured medicine was always a safe answer. That night, something took the bundle. No sound, no trace, just gone. And something left behind in its place. Not on the railing this time, but hanging from the low branch of the hemlock by the water barrel. A feather, dark and stiff, wrapped in another thin strip of willow. No knot this time, just a twist. He didn't touch it. By the second week of thaw, the forest had turned louder. Birds coming back. Squirrels running in jerks across half-melted snow. The wind no longer creaked through empty branches, but danced across budding ones. He started taking the creature with him again. It followed without leash or word, trailing him through the woods like a long-legged shadow. It didn't speak, but it watched everything, tasted sap from trees he scored with his knife, sniffed at mushrooms and turned them over with delicate fingers. Sometimes it crouched by the creek and ran its hands over the stones like it was reading them. One morning the sun hadn't risen yet, just smeared light behind the eastern ridge, when Edwin went out with the axe. The old pine behind the choy had dropped another limb in the night, and he wanted it cleared before the mud thickened. He swung twice, then 3 times, before the wind changed. It dropped hard from the ridgeline, sudden and strange, cold again, too cold. He paused, breath held. Then came the crack, a sound not made by tree or wind. Wood under pressure, followed by a thud. Not close, but not far. He dropped the axe, started running. The trail pitched uphill toward the old deer path, where stones gathered in heaps under thin birch. The sound had come from there, and when he rounded the curve near the dry creek bed, he saw it. The tree had split at the base, roots torn up in the soggy ground. The trunk angled down, still half held by another leaning cedar. Beneath it, caught at the shoulder and pinned hard to the slope, was Edwin, or it would have been, if not for the blur of movement beside him. The creature had gotten there first. He hadn't even realized he'd cried out. But the pain told him now. His right arm hung loose at his side, shoulder crushed beneath the angle of the trunk. He couldn't pull free, couldn't move. The creature let out a low, fast sound, not quite a growl, but something from the throat, and disappeared behind the cedar. A moment later, there was a shove, then another. The tree shifted, groaned, dropped 1 more inch into the slope. Edwin bit back a scream. Then another shape appeared, taller, broader. Not the young one, a second being. It didn't speak, didn't hesitate, just stepped forward and placed both massive hands under the fallen trunk and lifted. Not fully, not far, but just enough. The younger one reached in, hooked its long arms beneath Edwin's back and hips, and dragged him sideways like a bundle of sticks. Once clear, he dropped into the moss and curled inward, gasping, teeth clenching on the copper taste of his own blood. Then, still on his side, he looked up. Both of them stood over him. One crouched, face low, watching him breathe. The other stepped back into the tree line without a word. The one who stayed leaned in. Its hand, large, dense, fur matted with leaf bits and pine sap, touched his collarbone, then pressed gently on his sternum. Not with force, not to threaten, just feeling, checking. And Edwin knew it was seeing if he'd make it. Not out of pity, not out of debt, just because. Then it rose and vanished into the trees. By dusk, he'd dragged himself back to the choy with a makeshift sling and half a bottle of old rye. He set the bone himself, fingers shaking. The pain turned white, then gray, then black for a moment. But he woke to the fire still crackling, the creature beside him again, holding the same knot of willow it had left the week before. But this time, it set it in his hand. Like a token, like proof. He didn't cry, but the tears came anyway. Days passed. The shoulder bruised deep, but the swelling eased. The creature kept near but gave space. Sometimes it brought him bark strips with sap already scored. Once it left a bird egg unbroken. Another time, a smooth stone warm from the sun. And then, one morning, Edwin stepped out to find the hemlock branch empty. No feather, no knot, but something else. His porch rail had been brushed clean of dust and leaves. Every inch of it. Like someone had taken a wide palm and swept it in one slow pass. A trail, a gesture, a line drawn and erased at the same time. That night, as the moon broke through cloud and bathed the choy in silver, Edwin stood at the doorway and knew he wasn't being watched anymore. He was being trusted. Got it. Writing Chapter 5 now. Following your detailed outline and all strict narrative rules as instructed. Hayfork was louder in the spring. Not from the birds or the thaw, but from men who drank too long past noon and talked too much with mouths shaped by doubt and diesel. The bar off Main Street, the one with a rusted Miller sign half lit in the window, held 3 such men that day. Backs hunched over mugs, boots wet with creek mud, voices low but thick with certainty. One of them said he'd seen tracks the size of dinner plates by the ridge trail. Another swore he heard tree knocks, 3 in a row, up near Rock Face Hollow. The third just sipped and muttered, "It ain't no bear, I know that much." A decision rose from those beers and that stubborn quiet. By dusk, they'd agreed to head out at first light with rifles, flashlights, and stories they wanted to prove true. And like all bad ideas, it spread faster than wildfire in dry grass. Edwin Pike didn't hear it from the bar, but from the hardware store clerk who mumbled something about, "Your side of the woods getting busy." The kind of busy that brought men stomping through branches without knowing what they were waking. By the time Edwin reached the tree line that evening, the sun was already melting into a blood-orange smear across the hills. His breath fogged as he moved, carefully, deliberately, across the trail leading to the choy. Every boot print he'd ever made he covered in ash from his fire pit, stirred with leaves and broken twigs. He rubbed pine tar on the doorknob, wiped his skin oils from every latch. He knew what they were hunting. He knew who they might find. The creature, smaller now only by comparison, not weakness, stood watching from the shadows near the woodpile. It tilted its head but didn't approach. Edwin raised a hand, soft and slow, then crouched by the edge of the porch where the path began. He took a piece of cedar and carved it into a crude boot sole, deep-treaded like the kind sold at the surplus store. He pressed it into soft dirt in the wrong direction, toward the ravine, then another, leading nowhere but confusion. He didn't sleep that night. Sat in the dark with a lamp turned low and the old rifle across his lap. Not to shoot, but to scare, if it came to that. Around 2 in the morning, he heard the first snap of branches far downhill. Then faint voices, laughing low, then stopping. Silence, then the chime of metal. Not his. Something new. They'd brought bells. Bells on lines wired through brush. A trick from trap lines used for bears or coyotes. Edwin cursed under his breath, pulled on his boots, and stepped into the black. The forest was not silent, just listening. Down past the hollow, through thick alder and ferns slick with dew, he spotted them. 3 figures moving slow, one leading with a flashlight too bright, scattering light like a whip. Another knelt, adjusting something. A line, a stake, a trap he didn't recognize. Edwin moved faster. He swept around the western side of the ridge, climbing to the outcrop above where the men had started their setup. There, he found an old pine with a rotted base, heavy and long, just thick enough. He waited, breath shallow, heart thudding, until the light below circled away. Then he pushed. The log didn't fall so much as roll, slow at first, scraping bark, then faster, faster, crashing through brush with a roar that split the night. It thundered down, snapping limbs, sending birds shrieking upward, and then bells, bells, and shouting. The chaos of men stumbling back, voices cracking, gun safeties clicking off, one firing wildly into the trees. He didn't move, just crouched low behind the ridge and listened. One of the men swore it was an avalanche. Another cried out, said he saw something move, something big. 10 feet tall, someone said, covered in fur, red eyes, just vanished. They didn't chase, not that night. Not with their hearts thudding like trapped things and their courage frayed to string. By dawn, Edwin circled back, found their camp cold and scattered. Beer cans half crushed. A half-eaten sandwich tossed near a snuffed fire. The bells were still wired, dangling from a split pine, shaking gently in the breeze. He stepped over them. Back at the choy, the creature waited. Not inside, but just beyond the tree line, where the sun filtered through. It stood with its back straight, arms loose at its sides, breathing deep. Then it turned, and it wasn't alone. Another figure stood farther back in the woods, older, taller. Its shoulders sloped with age or weight. Its face shadowed beneath the morning glare. It said nothing, did nothing. Edwin didn't raise his hand this time. He didn't need to. The younger creature stepped forward and stood beside him, not behind. They both watched the spot where the men had camped. The forest was already reclaiming the space. Smell of gun oil fading. The birds returning one by one. Then, like fog on the move, the elder faded back into the trees. The boy, Edwin could only think of it as a boy now, despite what it was, what it might be, lingered. Edwin turned and looked at him fully for the first time in days. A bruise still colored its thigh from where it had tripped last week crossing the rocks. Its eyes were darker now, not from pain, but thought. Like it was starting to see not just with instinct, but with memory. He wanted to say something. But what do you say to something that already knows? So he didn't. He walked to the edge of the fire pit, knelt, and drew a rough circle in the ash with a pine twig. Then 3 lines, one long, 2 short, like tracks in the snow. The creature knelt beside him, watched. Then it reached out, erased 1 line, left the other 2, and walked back toward the trees, but only halfway. Then it turned and waited. Under the June sky, the forest stopped pretending to be gentle. Heat clung to the trees like wet cloth, heavy and low, and every bird call felt distant, strained, like even the wild things knew something was off. The wind came from the south but didn't cool a thing. It only carried the dry breath of far-off fires and the smell of oil that didn't belong in the woods. Edwin stood barefoot in the creek just past dawn, water up to his ankles, shirt clinging to his back, eyes squinting toward the ridgeline. The air had shifted sometime in the night, and he didn't trust it. The young one was pacing again, not nervously, but with a strange alertness. Its head turned toward the same wind, nostrils flaring, shoulders tensed. Something in its gait had changed, too. Faster, less curious, more protective. It stopped just short of the clearing, eyes scanning the hills, and then it dropped low, one palm pressed to the ground, holding still. Edwin stepped out of the water without a word. He didn't have to ask. The forest had gone too quiet. By late morning, smoke was visible. Thin at first, like a farmer's brush pile, but moving wrong. Too far from any road, too close to the dead pine field. Edwin hiked out past the east ridge with the sun burning through his hat brim, boots soft in the loam, the pack on his back heavy with canteens. Not supplies. He moved like a man measuring his own limits. He found the scorched patch just west of the ravine where someone had poured gasoline on dry leaves. The blackened ground stretched in uneven lines like the fire had hesitated, pulled back by damp underbrush and luck. But there were prints, big ones, men's boots. Fresh. Too fresh. He followed them until he didn't want to anymore. Back at the choy, the young one waited in the tree line, still crouched. When Edwin approached, it stood and looked him full in the face. There was no question there, only warning. And Edwin answered by nodding once and heading straight for the shack. He didn't think twice. He pulled the cedar box from beneath the cot, opened it, and ran his hand across the bundle of maps he hadn't touched in years. Rolled beneath them, wrapped in a scrap of an old fire tarp, was a square of black mesh and silver foil. Fire blanket. He grabbed it, tied it across the small wooden chest where he stored his letters, then stood in the doorway for a long moment. The forest held its breath. The sky flickered above like it couldn't decide whether to cloud or clear. He stepped out onto the porch, looked once at the place that had held him through the ache of years, then turned and poured half a canister of lamp oil across the front beams. The rest he poured along the east side, near the base, soaking the grass. He struck the match with steady fingers, let the flame eat down toward his skin before he touched it to the oil-stained floorboards. The fire caught slow, like it was thinking about it. Then faster, hotter, climbing fast, licking up toward the eaves. Smoke poured upward in a gray-brown pillar, carried on the breeze toward the slope. The heat pulsed against Edwin's chest as he stepped back, watching his home of 30 years turn to gold and black. And somewhere deep in the woods, someone saw it. The scent of flame traveled faster than boots, but not faster than fear. He didn't have time to feel it, not yet, because the young one let out a short, sharp cry. Edwin turned. It pointed, not toward the fire, but farther east. Movement in the trees. Crashing, something stumbling, and then came the sound no one wants to hear in a fire. A scream. Human. Pained. Trapped. Edwin dropped the pack and ran. The heat burned his lungs as he crossed the threshold where the trees thinned and the old animal trail sloped downward toward the gulch. He followed the cry, one hand out to steady himself on trunks as he moved too fast for a man his age. Smoke choked the path. Branches crackled above. And then he saw him, one of the hunters, young, face streaked with soot, eyes wild, caught between two leaning trees, one leg pinned by a half-fallen trunk that must have cracked in the heat. He was trying to dig himself out with his hands, crying between curses, one boot off, foot slick with blood. Edwin slid to a stop beside him, but before he could touch the tree, a blur passed him. The Bigfoot female, not the young one, not the old one. She was massive, shoulders broader than Edwin remembered from that night weeks ago, chest rising like a bellows, and eyes burning not with rage, but pure focus. She reached down, gripped the trunk near the base, and lifted. Not all the way, not for long, but enough. With a groan of wood and muscle, she tilted the weight just enough that the man scrambled out, crawling, wheezing, collapsing beside Edwin like a bag of bricks. He stared at her, mouth open, bloodied hand raised like a question he'd forgotten how to ask. She didn't look at him, only at Edwin. Then she turned and vanished into smoke. Edwin dragged the man down the slope by his collar, one slow inch at a time, until they hit a clearing already scorched bare. He dropped him there, leaned back against a stump, and let the fire roar behind him. The man coughed, rolled over, then sat up and stared. You "You see that?" he stammered. "That thing, she pulled the damn tree off me." Edwin didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't explain. He just watched the flames climb the skeleton of his cabin and let the man sit with the knowing. By the time the sun dropped below the ridge, the fire had died to a smolder. The choy was gone. Only a black skeleton remained, beams still hissing, smoke curling into the sky like a signal for anyone still foolish enough to be watching. Edwin stood at the edge of it, boots in ash, pack slung again over his shoulder. He didn't speak, didn't cry, but he looked out toward the darkening trees, and in the stillness, he felt something shift. Something old, something finished, but not ended. Under the heavy hush of midsummer, Weaverville moved slower, like the heat had pushed time off track. You could hear the cicadas before you stepped off the porch, and even the dogs under shade didn't bark unless they had to. News didn't travel fast in towns like that. It clung, stuck to boots, floated in air-conditioned diners, passed along by calloused hands holding sweating bottles. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a warning. Just a sentence whispered again and again by someone who swore they knew someone who was there. "That thing in the woods pulled him out of the fire," they said. "Dragged him out with one hand like he was nothing." A pause, then always the same ending. "He's not lying. You can see it in his face." The man didn't talk much anymore. He didn't go back to the bar. Didn't go back to his trailer either. He walked into the sheriff's office 3 days after the fire and dropped a boot on the desk. Melted half through at the toe, like that was proof enough. Then he sat down, pale as bone, and said, "It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It looked right at me, and then it saved my life." No one laughed. Not out loud. Not with the smoke still fresh in the hills and the line of scorched earth running straight through the gulch like a warning no one had written down. Some folks went quiet. Some grew louder. The ones who laughed before didn't laugh anymore. The ones who were sure now seemed less so. The forest had changed shape in their minds, stretched a little taller, a little darker. Something had stepped out of the fog and into the open, just enough for folks to realize they didn't know what they were living beside. And maybe never did. Edwin heard the story from the grocery clerk who still used paper bags. She told it like it was a riddle, like maybe he could solve it, like maybe it was just another thing wild men knew that town men didn't. He didn't nod. He didn't argue. He just paid for the salt and matches, tucked the paper bag under his arm, and walked back out into the heat with his head low. He slept in canvas now, a green army tent pitched by the creek, shaded by 3 cottonwoods, held down with stones instead of stakes. No fire ring, no chimney. Just him, a bedroll, and whatever air the trees would give. The young one had been sleeping farther away lately, not gone, just keeping distance. It had grown taller over the weeks, stronger too. Its movements were smooth now, confident. The limp had faded to a memory. It still came close sometimes, dragging fish to the bank or dropping berries near the flap of the tent. But it didn't linger. It was listening to something Edwin couldn't hear. The nights were still warm, but the silence had changed. One morning, Edwin stepped outside and knew something was different. The woods didn't feel empty. They felt paused. And across the clearing, standing just beyond the creek where the fog clung low to the grass, were 3 of them. The young one stood between them, smaller still, but not uncertain. The tallest, broader at the chest, fur silvered at the shoulder, lifted its head and gave a long, low sound. Not a cry, not a howl. Just a tone deep enough to shake your ribs if you were close enough. And somehow, Edwin understood. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't goodbye. It was a call. The young one looked back once, held Edwin's gaze longer than it ever had, then turned and walked. Didn't run, didn't hide, just followed. The trio disappeared between trees, their bodies vanishing one by one as if the forest opened for them. Leaves didn't move, branches didn't snap. Only the air changed, cooler still. as if something ancient had finished its part and didn't need an audience. Edwin stood for a long time, didn't sit, didn't go back inside. He walked to the water, knelt by the edge, and dipped his hands in. The cold bit hard. He splashed it on his face, his arms, let it soak his shirt. The wind shifted, and he didn't look up. Not until later, when the light had turned pale and the sun hung low behind the ridge. He stepped back to the tent, bent to check the line where his coat hung. And that's when he saw it. On the center pole, tied with care, not looped, not loose, but with a double knot at the end of a fresh willow strip. Clean, tight, precise. He didn't touch it, just stared. Then nodded once, barely, and sat down on the rock by the fire pit he hadn't used since the burning. He didn't cry, but something cracked open behind his ribs and let air in. The night came slow. The tent flapped once in the breeze. The creek babbled on, and the stars blinked one by one into place, like old eyes keeping watch over the last chapter of something only a few would ever understand. The forest came back to life slow, like a wound healing from the inside. By early October, the ridgelines were bleeding red and amber. Dogwoods turned rust. Cottonwoods blazed yellow. Every breath of wind sent leaves twisting down like old letters no one would ever read. The river ran lower now, its voice softer, the water dark with shadow. And there, between two knotted oaks, stood a shack not quite finished but proud in its own quiet way. Cedar beams, hammered tin, windows framed with driftwood. Edwin had built it alone, one plank at a time, using salvaged boards from the firewood pile, a few donated tools, and what was left of his back. It wasn't meant to last forever, just long enough. He kept the stove small this time, low to the ground, bricked in tighter. He cut the door shorter, made the roof slope wide and low so snow would never pool and weight wouldn't press down the way it had that last winter before everything changed. He lined the sill with rocks from the creek, flat, smooth, cool to the touch. Not for decoration, for memory. Some still had soot on them. Every morning he wrote, not long entries, not stories, just the date, the weather, the way the wind moved. October 3rd, north breeze, smelled like maple. Chickadees back. October 7th, found prints near the creek, not boot, too wide. He didn't mention names, didn't record places. No directions, no coordinates. Only what he felt. The way a tree bent, the broken angle of moss. One entry simply said, "Something watched." In a manila envelope tucked inside the second drawer of his desk were 3 letters, all addressed the same. May Corbin, U.S. Forest Service, Trinity Ranger District. He hadn't written her since her last visit in May, when she'd stood at the edge of the burned clearing and said nothing for almost an hour. She'd taken nothing with her that day except a memory and a silent handshake. She never asked questions, and that was how he knew she'd understand the letters. He called them observations, but they weren't. They were a kind of apology. In the first, he explained what he once believed the forest owed him. In the second, what he'd learned it never had to give. And in the third, he wrote only one thing: protect what stays quiet. The letters were sealed, placed inside a tin box, and buried beneath a cairn of flat river stones beside the old trail that no one walked anymore. If May came back, she'd know where to look. If she didn't, the stones would guard them like teeth. The air grew colder near the end of the month. Frost whispered in early. Squirrels moved frantic in the underbrush, stuffing mouths with acorns too early to be ripe. Edwin split logs with a rhythm that matched the silence of everything around him. No hammering, no echo. Just the solid thunk of steel on wood, like a heartbeat steadying itself. He didn't expect them back, not because they weren't watching, but because they didn't need to be seen. He talked less now. Sometimes he hummed. Mostly old hymns, half forgotten. Sometimes nothing at all. He found comfort in the pause between sounds. He moved slow in the mornings, letting the stove warm his knees before he stretched his shoulders. One day, he found a feather on the railing. Not black like before, but mottled gray. Tucked under it, a dried sprig of cedar. That night, he lit the lamp late and let it burn past midnight, just in case. On the morning of the first frost, mist clung thick across the yard, the kind that held itself close to the ground, swallowing sound. Edwin stepped outside with a tin cup of chicory, wrapped in his old flannel, and felt the stillness before he saw it. The knot was back. Willow bark, fresh, not frayed, double-tied, hung from the overhead beam above his porch swing, where he sat most evenings with his boots off and his eyes half-lidded toward the ridge. He stared at it a long time, didn't touch it, didn't need to. He knew. It wasn't just thanks. It wasn't farewell. It was the kind of mark one being leaves for another when words don't belong in the air. When the act itself has already spoken everything there is. He sat down on the swing, sipped the last of the coffee, let the steam rise into the cold, and smiled. Not for joy, but for the understanding that some things don't need explaining, that what was taken once had been returned in a form no man could name. Later that afternoon, he walked the trail with a bag of salt and left it near the northern bend where the berries had grown thickest that summer. He laid down a sliver of smoked fish beside it and folded a dry birch leaf over top, pressed with a stone. It wasn't an offering. Not exactly. Just a way of saying, I remember. The next day it was gone. The stone was turned upside down. Back inside, he folded a fresh sheet into the journal. Wrote the date. The smell of the air. A note about the way the trees creaked only when the wind blew south. Then he wrote one line more. I think they forgive. He capped the pen, closed the book, stood and stretched, slow, like the day didn't need anything more from him. And outside, behind him, the forest stood. Quiet, unchanged, unburdened by the memory of what it held. But not unguarded, not unknowing, not anymore. Some stories never ask to be told out loud. They unfold in quiet spaces, between broken tree limbs and forgotten footpaths, where the wind carries memory better than any name ever could. And sometimes, if you listen close enough, you'll hear it. Something old, something true, breathing in the hush between heartbeats, in the silence that follows kindness freely given. This was never a story about proof or legends or the need to be believed. It was about something older than language, about trust earned, not demanded, about the fragile threads that stretch between worlds we think are separate, human and wild, seen and unseen, known and unknowable. And how sometimes, with patience, with mercy, those threads hold. It's easy to overlook what stays quiet, to ignore what doesn't shout or shine or sell itself. But the things that matter most often move through the world without making a sound. They heal in secret. They forgive without asking. They watch over us from the edges of the firelight, content not to be understood, only respected. There's something sacred in the act of simply staying, of showing up day after day, in a world that forgets to look back. And maybe that's all we're really called to do. Be present, be gentle, and leave behind more care than harm. Not for praise, not for proof, but because something deep inside us remembers that we, too, were once watched over by something we never saw, and maybe still are. So if ever you find yourself in a moment of stillness, in the hush of trees, in the space between raindrops, in the soft brush of something unseen, don't run. Don't doubt. Just breathe. You might not be alone. And maybe, just maybe, that's a good thing. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story found a place in your heart, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear what stayed with you. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. Until then, stay kind, stay curious, and keep listening for the quiet things. They're often the ones that matter most.